Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you today for joining us for our Lunch and Learn on clean transportation policy here in Illinois. I know um, this beginning of this year has felt like a lot of chaos and uncertainty from the national level, but we're hoping that today we can get a little bit of clarity of what's happening here in Illinois as it relates to clean transportation policy. This particular Lunch and Learn does have CLE credits for Illinois attorneys, and we're happy to provide that. There's a sign up there in the chat from our Tech Hannah Demboski here in Illinois. But I'm gonna put myself on pause soon, and but before I do, I want to introduce our presenter today, Neda Deylami, who is a vehicle electrification manager with the Environmental Defense Fund. Her work takes her across the federal spectrum, but she also focuses a lot on Illinois and Maryland policies. So we're really lucky to have Neda here with us. She started her journey as in EV advocacy, as her own personal organizer for her own charging needs here in the city of Chicago. A lot of her work has taken her to fight for greater access for charging needs for renters and those living in multi-unit dwellings. And she's looking to adopt further electric vehicle adoption across the country. So we're really lucky to have here. As an attorney, she has drafted legislation and it's provided the expert testimony on cost-effective EV readiness for charging infrastructure and equitable right to charging access for all. So, Neda, without any further ado, I would love to turn it over to you to walk us through clean transportation policy for Illinois.
Cool. Thank you, Danny. Thanks, IC. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Excited to see that people are interested in this topic. Today, I'm going to be talking about state level clean transportation policy for Illinois, including specifically how the Clean Air Act allows states to adopt vehicle emissions policies, standards stronger than federal standards, what the implications of these programs are, what the role of the federal government is in overseeing state adoption. And because of how quickly things are moving at the federal level, if this is watched later, it might be out of date, just a note. And I think it's important to discuss emissions today because next week, the Illinois Pollution Control Board has scheduled final hearings to consider adoption of some of these standards that I'll get into. So it might get a little dense and wonky. There's a Q&A open, and there should be plenty of time for questions. Next slide. This is just a short agenda, just going through what transportation emissions are, info about the Clean Air Act, legally how these programs work, and get into what federal oversight has been like. Next slide. Okay, so most of you probably know transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. On-road vehicles are the majority of them, and of those, majority are passenger vehicles. Fossil fuel powered vehicles emit carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, which contributes to climate change, but they also emit other pollutants like nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, and ozone, which can worsen air quality and cause health impacts like asthma, lung disease, and cardiovascular problems, among others. A Northwestern study last year found that in the Chicagoland area alone, medium heavy-duty vehicles, which are most frequently fueled by diesel, emit a disproportionate amount of pollutants and contribute to at least 500 deaths and 600 new cases of childhood asthma each year, as you can see on the map. And when looking at particulate matter exposure, 12 counties in Illinois are in the top 9% of the worst diesel pollution in the country. Cook and DuPage are the top 1%. So zero emission vehicles, in particular electric vehicles, are important to discuss here because they have no tailpipe pollution. They have lower greenhouse gas impacts over their lifetimes compared to internal combustion engines because of their superior engine energy efficiency. And as the grid continues to decarbonize, such as under the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, EVs will only get cleaner and cleaner, and the more that they replace gas and diesel vehicles, the more that air quality will improve. Next slide. So the Clean Air Act is a law that was first passed in 1963. It had significant amendments in 1970, 77, and 90. Its general goal was to regulate air pollution and to protect public health. It set standards for air quality and allowed the EPA to regulate pollution sources, namely here mobile sources like vehicles, and set baseline standards for air pollutants for light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles. Manufacturers must meet the federal baseline at minimum. That's the bar for everyone. But Section 209B grants California special authority to establish more protective, that is at least as protective of public health and welfare as federal standards than the federal ones, because their air pollution was so severe and they were regulating vehicle emissions before the Clean Air Act was passed, so they can get a waiver from federal preemption. In addition to on-road vehicle regulation, California can also get a preemption waiver for non-road vehicles and engines from the 1990 amendment of the Clean Air Act. Next slide. So they've gotten dozens of waivers over the last 50 years, but today I'm going to be talking about the programs that are most relevant to us in policy in Illinois, and crucially that the Pollution Control Board is considering for Illinois. The first is Advanced Clean Cars 2, or ACC2. Along with criteria, pollutants, and greenhouse gas limits for internal combustion engine vehicles, ACC2 sets a timeline for increasing sales of new zero-emission vehicles, passenger vehicles, reaching for 100% of new sales to be ZEV by 2035. It applies to model year 26 to 35. And there was a previous Advanced Clean Cars program, which went from model year 2015 to 2025. I think it's important to note here that up to 20% of manufacturers' credits may be met with plug-in hybrid EVs, which really emphasizes like how flexible the rule is. So this is not an EV mandate. And in addition, because manufacturers are overperforming right now and exceeding their credit requirements already by ACC, it's pretty easy to meet the ACC2 requirements through early action credits and credit pooling, which is where they can trade across states until 2030. So using the past credits alone, manufacturers would only have to make about 2% of sales to meet the model year 26 requirements, or they could spread it out along the 5 years to 2030, but it would still be less than 30% of sales each year. And just to contrast that, EVs were more than 25% of California sales, almost 10% in Illinois, and 9% nationally, and growing a bunch every year. The next program is Advanced Clean Trucks. It's a sales target for medium heavy duty manufacturers. They affect only new sales, not used vehicles or existing vehicles. Also not an EV purchase mandate. It increases supply and availability for those who want the choice to make it. It also doesn't go to 100% of sales. So both of these programs, they're credit deficit programs where manufacturers accrue deficits through internal combustion engine sales, and they generate credits with ZEVs. So there's a lot of flexibility built in to meet compliance, like trading between manufacturers. For the ACT, they could trade between vehicle classes and bank them for future years. But they are important for consumers because it expands the availability and supply of vehicles in the state, because manufacturers prioritize the states that have adopted these rules when they're deciding where to invest sales and operations for their ZEVs. And that's how we have, for example, ACT states only make up 25% of all truck registrations in the country, but they have 38% of electric truck registrations in the country. Both of these also really lay a path for gradual adoption of ZEVs. No one's, trying to electrify every vehicle tomorrow, but it does help lay that path so that utilities can plan the grid, charging providers can build out charging infrastructure, all that good stuff. Next slide. And the next rule is the heavy duty omnibus low NOx rule, also just called the low NOx rule. It sets criteria pollutant limits for new diesel engines with more effective exhaust testing requirements, longer useful life and emissions warranty periods. And it can be achieved through pretty simple technological fixes that exist today to reduce nitrogen oxide emissions by up to 90%. This is really important because unlike the previous policies that affect ZEVs only, and especially because the ACT doesn't go to 100% of sales, we know that diesel vehicles are going to continue to be made and sold and on our roads. Fleets especially, they work on an acquisition cycle. So every year that new diesel vehicles are bought, they're going to be in use for 10 to 15 years. They'll continue to impact public health, especially in pollution burdened areas with a lot of truck traffic. So it's important to encourage ZEV technology while also limiting pollution from new non-ZEVs that continue to be driven on our roads. Advanced Clean Fleets is a demand side complement to ACT, where ACT addresses the supply in the market. It would have required large corporate fleets, public fleets, and drayage, which are port and rail yard vehicles, to transition their fleets to ZEVs 100%. By 2035 for drayage, last mile delivery, and yard trucks, which are the easiest to electrify, 2039 for work trucks and day cab tractors, and 2024 for sleeper cab tractors and specialty vehicles. I say would have because EPA did grant waivers for the ACT in 2023, ACC2 and HDO in 2024, but not Advanced Clean Fleets. So California rescinded its request for the waiver before Trump took office, which is why I'm talking about in the past tense, because California cannot enforce the ACF or any rule without a waiver, but more on that later. Next slide. So here's where the other states come in. Section 177. Section 177 of the Clean Air Act allows states to adopt California emission standards instead of following that baseline federal standard. Those are the two options. You can do federal or California. That's it for states. There is an identicality requirement for what states adopt, and there must be a 2-year delay between when California or a state adopts standards and when it's enforced. So, for example, when Illinois adopts these standards in 2025, as it is contemplating, they will be enforced for model year 2029, which starts on January 1st, 2028. Next slide. This is going to be a map of all of the Section 177 states. They together make up 40% of the car and light truck market. Purple is all 3 of those programs. Dark blue is just Maryland for ACC2 and ACT, and the blue are ACC only. 10 states have adopted all 3 of these right now. You can see on the map: California, Colorado, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Washington. ACC is also marked here because it ended in model year 15. Nevada and Minnesota only adopted that first Advanced Clean Cars program, and Pennsylvania did not adopt the ZEV portion of Advanced Clean Cars. Also important to note here are that Colorado, Delaware, and New Mexico did not adopt the program completely. They end at 2032, which is when ZEVs must make up 82% of new car sales. Nevertheless, it's a really big market that Illinois is crucially not a part of right now. Next slide. So federal oversight into this program, into these standards, basically when California decides that it wants more protective standards, it has to file for an authorization request to enforce them with the EPA. EPA holds notice and comment periods, it publishes in the Federal Register, and determines whether certain requirements have been met in the law, and then publish in the Register if they are approved. The requirements are that California was not arbitrary and capricious in finding that its standards are at least as protective as the federal baseline. It has to demonstrate the need for standards to meet compelling and extraordinary conditions, horrendous air quality, for example. And under Section 202A, they must be technologically feasible, and any test procedures must not conflict with federal test procedures. So states adopting California standards do not have to seek EPA approval individually like this, but a preemption waiver must be granted to California before enforcement can begin for any state. Next slide. So I want to talk about the history of preemption waivers regarding vehicle emissions. Greenhouse gases were generally not regulated until the mid-2000s. They were not explicitly mentioned in the Clean Air Act until actually the Inflation Reduction Act added them in an amendment. In 2007, a Supreme Court case, Massachusetts v. EPA, required the EPA to determine whether greenhouse gas emissions endangered public health and welfare, such that regulation would be required. So not ordering them what to regulate, just to determine if it does endanger public health. The court did make clear that even though EPA is regulating climate pollution, at the same time, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, regulates fuel economy standards under another law, the Energy Policy and Conservation Act. Even though these two are happening at the same time, the Supreme Court was really clear that both agencies can work together to meet congressional mandates in setting standards however they have to. In 2008, the Bush EPA denied a waiver. It was the only outright denial of a waiver for California's greenhouse gas standards. And in 2009, the Obama administration withdrew that denial and approved it. Obama's EPA also issued an endangerment finding about greenhouse gases, like mentioned in the Massachusetts case, which triggered Clean Air Act regulation by the EPA and therefore informed the first national CO2 tailpipe emission standards, and it was aligned with California's. In 2019, Trump's EPA did the first ever revocation of a waiver. It argued that California's greenhouse gas and ZEV standards were preempted by the federal government's authority to set fuel economy regulations under that EPCA Act. And they argued that California didn't need, in quotes, a greenhouse gas regulation to meet the required compelling and extraordinary conditions. They said that, greenhouse gases affect global climate change. It's not a local, state, and air quality issue. But of course, we know that reducing tailpipe greenhouse gases also reduces criteria pollutants, which affect air quality, which is a local issue. After that, the California and states, along with EEF, sued, saying that EPA exceeded its authority in revoking the waiver, and this actually violated the Clean Air Act framework because states have independent authority to regulate emissions outside of just fuel economy rules. Fuel economy rules are more about, fuel efficiency, such as this, compared to such as the ZEV program, which requires sales of EVs in a particular state, or ZEVs in a particular state. In 2022, Biden administration reinstated that 2013 waiver by Obama. So the 2019 litigation that I just talked about is actually moot because the parties filed a stipulation to dismiss it. The court dismissed it in 2024, in July 2024. So there's no pending litigation here to settle. When Biden did that, he argued that the EPA, I should say, argued that the Clean Air Act doesn't allow for a previously granted waiver to be revoked. It just has to look at whether the conditions are met under the law to grant or deny. The reinstatement of that waiver, though, that subsequent decision then caused further litigation that would set the stage for any legal discussion of whether revoking or rescinding a waiver is possible, which is in the next slide. That litigation was Ohio v. EPA. It challenged EPA's preemption waiver for California's greenhouse gas standards and ZEV program known as Advanced Clean Cars after Biden reinstated that waiver. The DC Circuit Court of Appeals held that Section 209B, the waiver clause of the Clean Air Act, does not violate the equal sovereignty doctrine of the US Constitution, which is what they tried to challenge. The US, that equal sovereignty doctrine says that it limits Congress's authority to enact legislation that treats different states differently without sufficient justification. So they found that that was not the case here because it was an exercise of Congress's power pursuant to the Commerce Clause, interstate commerce, or interstate pollution. Recently, the Supreme Court declined writ to review that question and only granted review of standing in the Diamond Alternative Energy case, which is oil and gas interests. So because they didn't rule on the merits, the ACC waiver and therefore the program remain intact, as well as the ACT because its litigation is in abeyance pending that Ohio decision, and then another case, lots of cases, the Texas v. EPA case, which is ruling on EPA standards. The ACT litigation is the Western States Trucking Association v. EPA, and that challenged the ACT waiver that EPA granted, arguing that it violates the major questions doctrine because of the impact the rules would have over the vehicle market. The major questions doctrine is when an agency is precluded from exercising regulatory authority over an issue of vast economic or political significance without clear congressional authorization to do so. They also argued the waiver is inconsistent with that Section 202A, which is the part that says EPA has to regulate any air pollutant, not mandate EVs, is their argument. So therefore, the EPA cannot issue a waiver that mandates EVs, end quote. We know that these are not EV mandates, as we went over. There's also the American Free Enterprise Chamber of Commerce, the EPA, which challenged the ACC2 and HTO waivers in separate lawsuits. Both of them are expected to go into abeyance. And then lastly, in June 2023, the California Air Resources Board came to an agreement with some manufacturers on aligning the HTO, the low NOx rule, with federal standards. In exchange, industry agreed not to challenge the ACT in court. So while there could be some potential litigation over potential waiver withdrawals, this could serve at least as a stopgap for any kind of market certainty or consistency for manufacturers, reduces their threat of injury pending litigation. Next slide. So along with that litigation, challenging recently granted waivers, there are other emerging issues, a lot of emerging issues. Things happen every day in the Trump administration. So the administration has indicated that it wants to get rid of the waiver, right? Potentially trying to revoke or rescind them, which is most likely illegal. The Clean Air Act only allows EPA to grant or deny waivers. The standards that California must meet to get a waiver, they're still valid. They still are under the extraordinary and compelling conditions of horrendous air quality. And the consideration of those requirements, it's it only applies when they are considering getting issuing a waiver, not it can't be applied retroactively to revoke them. The California standards are still at least as strict as the federal ones. The air quality is still bad and needs stricter emission standards to improve air quality, and consistency with Section 202A is where the time and the feasibility. Manufacturers have had plenty of time and are already over complying with the rules, as I mentioned, so they cannot argue technological infeasibility. Crucially, only Congress can change the Clean Air Act through an amendment, but the Trump EPA submitted the waivers to Congress for something called the Congressional Review Act, or CRA. The CRA allows Congress by a majority vote within a specified amount of time to overturn a recently adopted rule, after which an agency cannot adopt a rule that is, quote, substantially the same. The CRA defines rule by the Administrative Procedure Act, which governs agency rulemaking, but the California waiver isn't a rule under the Administrative Procedure Act. There's several decisions to back this up. The Congressional Research Service report from October 2024 distinguished a rule from an order in the following way. Rules operate generally, but a decision to apply existing legal standards to a particular set of facts is an order, not a rule. So the California regulations in California are rules, but the EPA preemption waivers are not, because they meet those conditions. Only California can enforce regulations. The waiver is just looking at whether California rules meet the legal requirements of the Clean Air Act to be granted a waiver. So there's that, applying existing legal standards. Also, it has particular applicability to California. There was a separate US Government Accountability Office report that found in 2023 the California waiver is not subject to a CRA because of its particular applicability to California. Opposition will claim that California is essentially setting standards for the whole country because of its influence in the market. But that's pretty irrelevant to the law, given that states have this authority to exercise their sovereign authority under the Clean Air Act. And then late yesterday, I found that the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, found once again that the CRA is inapplicable to Clean Air Act preemption waivers, and EPA's submission of them to Congress is inconsistent with case law. Nevertheless, Republicans are expected to introduce resolutions launching the review process as early as next week, which is why I mentioned things change every day. We'll see. In general, though, I think it's important to say that applying the CRA to EPA preemption waivers could open up a whole Pandora's box on other issues. It would create a precedent for any number of executive actions outside the original scope of the CRA to be invalidated through this procedure. And for example, that could be decisions about individual Americans' eligibility for Social Security. It could be waivers for state Medicaid programs or veterans and other financial health benefits. Nationally significant policy decisions such as approvals of mergers between major corporations and orders greenlighting energy infrastructure projects. So the EPA actions at issue here are a decision from 2023, which is far outside the CRA's time limit. And moving forward with these resolutions sets a really dangerous precedent for future administrations to submit a prior administration's orders from any time period, like since 1996, for CRA review, which is not good. Also, Trump's EPA is considering repealing the 2009 endangerment finding that I mentioned that Obama's EPA did, which found that greenhouse gases may be regulated under the Clean Air Act, and that's how the national tailpipe pollution standards started. There's also shenanigans going on in the implementation. California's model year 2024 saw such overcompliance with the CT from growing truck sales. But manufacturers are pushing to delay enforcement anyway in the places and states that have model year 2025 enforcement, such as in Massachusetts, where their Department of Environmental Protection proposed rules to delay the HDO to 2026. They also exempted some vehicles from the ACT. In Oregon, there is a bill, House Bill 3119, that wants to delay the ACT enforcement to 2027. And New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation proposed enforcement discretions for snow plows and street cleaning vehicles, and also sent out a couple weeks ago a letter of assurance to manufacturers on the ACC2 about how flexible the program is. Like, don't worry, you can have a deficit for 3 years without penalty. We're not even checking compliance until the September after the relevant model year. So like, don't freak out. But really, I think the important takeaway is that this rule compliance is the manufacturer's responsibility. They've agreed to comply to them, such as under the ACT agreement. And now they're creating this false crisis by attempting to put the burden exclusively on dealers, like they're imposing quotas that have nothing to do with electric trucks or either of these regulations. They're ratioing, or they're requiring a certain number of medium heavy duty ZEV sales before they allot diesel vehicles. And it's really just to make a political statement that electric trucks are infeasible, but they're doing that through essentially manipulating the market. With all this uncertainty, advocates may be looking elsewhere to reduce emissions. So one possible avenue is the indirect source review. The Clean Air Act, Go Clean Air Act, also explicitly allows states to regulate indirect sources. Indirect sources are facilities or structures that attract mobile source pollution, but they're not sources of pollution themselves. They're not a stationary source. And that's like warehouses, for example. Indirect source review is the facility by facility review of indirect sources of air pollution. The South Coast Air Quality Management District in Southern California already has an indirect source review where, surprise, regulated facilities are also over complying, because it turns out electrifying yard tractors is really easy. And legislation has also been introduced in New Jersey. EDF is doing this work in on the indirect source review in New York and Illinois as well. I think that's it. It's questions now. That was a lot, and I went through it faster than I expected. So. Did I freeze? Am I here? I was waiting for Danny.
We still hear you loud and clear, but we're happy to take any questions. Any questions in the chat, or raise your hand and come up. Can get you off mute, but yeah, and that was a lot of great information. There's so much going on in clean transportation space.
So much, but crucially, they are relevant to Illinois, because again, those hearings are next week, and we'll see what happens then.
Oh, see a question. Is there anything particular that we should advocate for at the Illinois level? This is from Leah Goodman.
Yeah, in the very, very immediate near term, asking the Pollution Control Board to adopt these standards is coming up in the final hearings next week. But I think that what we're seeing from other states is we're learning that it's not just adoption of the rules that is a hurdle, but also implementation of them. So again, Illinois would not begin until 2028, but manufacturers can earn early credits, they can bank them. So we are hoping to encourage the ZEV market earlier than 2028. And I think, I hope not, but we may expect to see resistance to enforcement, delaying, things like that, that we're seeing in other states. The reason we saw them in Massachusetts, New York, and Oregon is because they adopted these rules a lot earlier and were due to start enforcement this year.
Perfect. So I was wrong earlier. We have a Q&A function. Please use the Q&A function to ask some of these questions.
I'll add also, other than the standards, of course, you know, the indirect source rule is another way of directly regulating those emissions. But there are other policies that, you know, have to do with ZEV adoption or encouraging ZEV adoption that we can advocate for at the state level, like strengthening our fleet electrification goals for public fleets, you know, supporting transit, and like any kind of rebates or incentives, both for vehicles, chargers, charging infrastructure. There's a lot to do that are part of like all the complementary policies that we can do. I think what sets these in particular apart is that they are encouraging and like guaranteeing that the vehicles are actually going to be driven here, sold here, and replacing a gas or diesel vehicle that would otherwise be polluting the air. But there are other things that we can do to encourage and help people adopt the ZEVs.
Great. I think on that kind of line, we have another question from Ellen Partridge. Are there incentives that you would like to see employers offer for use, perhaps in conjunction with transit?
I mean, so currently in Illinois, from CEJO, we have some EV charger rebates for publicly used chargers. There are still the federal programs as well for incentives for vehicles and chargers. But I think relevant to the policies we're talking about today, it's really expanding like choices for people to get EVs in the first place, and then also, you know, plan for charging infrastructure build outs so that there are other options other than home charging, public charging, work charging, etc. Yeah, let the utilities know like there's going to be this amount probably of CEVs on the road, and this is what we need to plan for.
Great. Next question from David Fain. With the Trump administration dismantling of the NEVI program, is there talk about the state increasing its investment in EV chargers?
I feel like this could be an IEC question too. It's not specific to me.
Yeah, that's a great question, David. I think that is one of the challenges right now that we're facing at the state level of where we are facing a bit of budget constraints. So I think our goal here is working within the Clean Jobs Coalition to prioritize investment in key areas where charging infrastructure is most needed. I know Neda and I are working on the Zero Emission Vehicle Act to really focus our charging investments in key corridors and key communities that would most benefit, along with other priorities. So I think that is uh, one of our upcoming challenges this year. Okay. Um, I have another question here from Kelly Parfit. The Supreme Court is not environmental friendly and also seems to do whatever Trump wants. Are you confident that California would win if these rules were challenged?
Yeah, it's a great question and kind of the big question of the moment, I think. I do have hope that, for example, from their denying review of the merits of the Diamond Alternative Energy case and just on standing, if they really wanted to shut this down in litigation, they could have heard that case to decide on the merits whether these waivers can stand or not, but they chose not to do that. So it could be a delay, or it could be not wanting to talk about it. But I think either way, it's good for us that happened. It means that they're still standing. Really short of congressional amendment of the Clean Air Act. I think there really isn't a lot of room for legal argument to get rid of waivers. As unfriendly as certain parts of the Supreme Court are, I think they do have respect for rule of law in the most black and white cases in that, hopefully. Of course, I can't say for sure. But I think just emphasizing that the methods taken so far are legal, that there hasn't been any kind of decision made on the merits of whether the Clean Air Act and the waiver is constitutional or should be allowed, is really important, and that we should still continue kind of with our status quo as adopting these programs. Again, 2028 is an election year. That would be when we would begin enforcement. So it's not guaranteed that a future president would not hold these standards, or approve a denial or approve a waiver of them again, and continue that trajectory. The market is still also moving that way, so we can't really stop EV adoption. We can't. It's not no turning back, I think, but it's a matter of whether we can do it quickly enough to both meet our climate goals, as well as address like the very real and currently occurring harms that are being done in pollution burned areas.
All right. Any other questions? We have plenty of time here for Q&A.
I really thought I would take longer. Sorry about that.
No need to be sorry. Sometimes, when you have good information, it just comes out. And it was a lot of layered information. This is a very tricky subject, but we're really happy to have someone like that helping lead the charge here in Illinois, as well as across the country.
I think another point that I kind of touched on, but I can expand on also is like how close this is to Illinois. We manufacture a lot of ZEVs here. We manufacture a lot of components of EVs and batteries. So we are building them here. We do have the infrastructure for it. We have jobs because of it, and they're growing. I think like $9 billion in the last 10 years in Illinois alone. That's really cool. But it doesn't mean that the vehicles are actually going to be on the road here to clean up our air. When we look at something like Rivian that makes, delivery vans, which are really easy to electrify, they can most often have depot access where they can charge affordably and more accessibly. Those vehicles are not necessarily going to be prioritized to Illinois because Rivian is selling them in other states where they have to because of these rules.
Great. We have another question from Faith Bugo. How do you think tariffs will affect the cost of EVs?
Yeah, so for years now, the battery costs have been falling pretty dramatically. We're expecting price parity, so the same price of EVs and gasoline and just fossil fuel powered cars to be the same upfront cost by next year. That's kind of happening outside of these other factors just because of the increasing efficiency and density of batteries, just technology. There's a lot of battery manufacturing investing going on in the whole country. And that's really building up, I think, our capacity of building batteries. Of course, there are other parts in a car. And I think I read yesterday that the back and forth on the tariffs is also hard to keep up with, but that US vehicle manufacturers are going to be partially exempt from like car parts because, car parts are built in different countries and different places. They might be assembled here. So I think it's hard to say for sure, but I expect that overall prices are still going to fall for EVs just because the battery is currently the most expensive part of that, and that has been dropping really dramatically.
Perfect. I have a question here from an anonymous attendee. The federal government is removing charging stations and demand for Teslas is declining. Will states be able to fill in this infrastructure? And is there a good alternative to Tesla?
Yeah, the federal government is removing charging stations at federal government buildings, so not, everywhere, and there's still the private market, right? Demand for Tesla is declining. I think that's a great thing given the head of Tesla's behavior. But I think that there are other options, there are other infrastructure opportunities to expand charging. There is, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, which Trump has tried to freeze funding for, has already been investing in states. There are projects ongoing that it's just a matter of like building them and them coming online. So that's expanding really quickly. And then there's also just the private demand as EV adoption goes up. The market answers with more of that infrastructure, right? They both need to happen at the same time. And we know that unfortunately, EV adoption has outpaced EV charger growth. But we're catching up, especially in Illinois. I think last year we doubled our fast charger availability in the state, which is really cool. And of course, most people who have access to parking at home can charge at home and will never need to use a public charger. But there are plenty of alternatives to Tesla. There are dozens of ZEV models, full battery electric, plug-in hybrid electric, from everything from little hatchbacks to SUVs to bigger trucks. And there's, and the models there, I think more and more are going to be qualifying for tax credits. There are incentives in the state. So I'm not concerned about Tesla's fall contributing to slowing EV growth at all.
On this similar line of thought. Faith asks, what do you hear about Tesla's charging network opening up to non-Tesla vehicles?
Yeah, I think every manufacturer, every major manufacturer other than Mitsubishi has officially committed to working with Tesla and getting access for drivers to Tesla superchargers. A couple of manufacturers, I think Hyundai and Honda, I want to say, don't quote me on that, are already in their newer models coming with the native port to use Tesla superchargers. But I believe as of this model year, every manufacturer that has agreed to work with Tesla on supercharger access is giving adapters to people who buy their EVs so that they can access supercharging. And once you have that, it's really a matter of the software lining up to make sure that people can just drive up to superchargers, plug in and charge, and pay, virtually. But it's ongoing, and it's I think we know Hyundai already has access, Rivian. I can't quite remember the rest, but it's happening really quickly. Thanks for all these great questions.
We'll get maybe a couple more minutes to see if any other questions are popping up. But for folks, we'll drop again in the chat the sign up for attorneys to sign up for CLE credits. This is the beginning of multiple of these lunch and learns. We have other lunch and learns coming up in the next few months that attorneys can earn CLE credits. So we will follow up soon with more dates and more information on those, but you can expect things like building decarbonization or energy sector information in the next few months. And once again, we thank folks for coming today and continuing the conversation and continuing to learn about our current state of affairs and what we can do locally to make sure that we are protecting the momentum for climate needs. This transportation sector is a huge portion of where a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, and the work that Neda has done with the Environmental Defense Fund is really helping drive the message and change here. I do see we have another question. With increase in EVs, it puts greater demand on electricity grid. How can we make sure the grid is prepared?
By adopting these rules, honestly, is a big part of it, because it lays out kind of the path of how much EVs are going to be increasing each year. That is one way. I think part of the difficulty in utility planning generally is trying to guess how much load we're going to need, and building for it, but not building too much and not building too little, and the impact that could have on rates. So being able to say in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years, there's going to be this much demand from EVs is really, really helpful in that regard. This of course doesn't factor for all of the other things that take up demand, that like as the planet warms, we're going to need more AC, air conditioning, data centers are taking up, but at least for EVs, we can kind of plan the trajectory. It's not going to be overnight, right? That all vehicles are going to be electrified. And overnight is a really important part of this too, because most EVs charge at night, which is when the grid is not being used to its full capacity. So the more that it's using that electricity, the higher rate of return investment utilities get. So rates don't go up as quickly. You can manage charging in general with EVs. You can plan for them. You can plan for when the grid is cleaner, when demand is lower. Those are things that we can't really do with other appliances or needs that use electricity. If it's hot, you want to turn on your AC, but you can plan your EV to charge it when you're not using it overnight when you're asleep. I also wanted to add more about, I think, the Pollution Control Board effort, just for everyone's awareness. So we had one hearing in December, and this is going to be the final hearing, but it was really an effort from advocates like EDF and Sierra Club and some EJ partners of petitioning the Pollution Control Board to consider these rules in the first place. So, if you're interested, there is, like in any rulemaking process, there is a public comment opportunity to share why you think it's important for the board to adopt these rules, both written, there's in person, it's going to be in Springfield if you're in Springfield on Monday, but written submissions are probably going to be continue to be accepted even after the hearings end on Wednesday. And I think that's an important part of also like advocating for these things, sharing that, your public comment testimony, the fact that you think these are important and want to be passed to the Pollution Control Board, since they are an entity of the state of Illinois, the entity of the Illinois EPA, which is tasked with protecting our health, our air quality, our well-being. And one way to do that, the best way to do that in the transportation sector is by adopting emission standards at the state level.
Great. So hopefully next week we have some good news to share with folks. IC will follow up with um those things. Is there an action alert on the PCB rules that you can share?
I'm not sure that I would be able to hear. I know myself and others from Sierra Club are organizing. I'm not sure how I could like put my email in if people want to find out more.
Yeah, I think you could maybe just speak it out loud. Maybe would that be
Oh, I have
helpful?
access to the chat. Never mind. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'll put my email in the chat. You can
yeah.
tell.
There you go. For folks, we have more questions about the Pollution Control Board or any other things related to EVs or clean transportation priorities. Um, that is email is in the chat. We still have time for questions on air. So feel free to um, drop more questions.
Danny, and Neda, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just go a little more into truck emissions and some possibilities for regulation in the future. I know you covered some, but just wondered if you could give an update on that.
Yeah, I mean the two of the programs that I discussed here in the ACT and the low NOx rule would directly regulate truck emissions, medium heavy duty vehicles, as well as new diesel engine vehicles. So these two together work to both adopt vehicles that don't have tailpipe pollution, as well as cleaning up the ones that do exist. Indirect source review is pretty directly related to trucks and truck attracting facilities. Those tend to be pretty like densely located either to each other or in residential areas near schools and parks and homes. And of course, the workers that are exposed to that pollution as well. So those are ways that we can encourage adoption, ZV adoption pretty easily, like with last mile delivery. Not a lot of mileage on those vehicles. They have long dwell time, and then also electric like yard trucks, things that move around containers or trucks in between, ports or rail yards or things like that. Places where things are being moved essentially from one place to another. Yeah. Was there another that you had in mind?
Well, I think just think about those, and if those didn't go forward, are there other ways to regulate emissions from trucks that other states are doing or that you're thinking about? Just am interested in the policy scope.
Yeah, I think the problem with this overall framework is that it's either the federal standards or the California standards on emissions themselves, the regulating of emissions, I should say, not just like encouraging ZEVs in general. So there's still going to be other pathways or opportunities, policy opportunities for encouraging like large fleets to go electric, incentives to afford them, incentives to install charging infrastructure, having like requirements on the accessibility and like affordability of the charging infrastructure. We know that charging infrastructure really is like the chicken and egg to the vehicle adoption. So with those, just making it as easy as possible, as affordable as possible for those who need the help to access the vehicles, those who want it, it is really like the only way that we can get to the ZV adoption we're trying to see. It's just that these rules really make it easier to increase that consumer choice and availability. But it's as far as like regulating emissions, it's California's or the federal baseline.
Oh, Danny, you're muted.
Sorry about that, y'all. Just another question in the chat. Ellen Partridge asked, mileage in cars keeps increasing. Won't that overshadow the benefits of EVs if there's not further demand management?
Yeah, EVs alone will not save us. I will be the EV advocate to say that they will not save us by themselves. We definitely need to build up transit and walkable cities to reduce the mileage in general, because there's still energy being used for EVs, right? Even though they are vastly more energy efficient than ICE vehicles. Their internal combustion engines have like 20% efficiency, whereas EVs use about 90% of the energy they have to actually move the car. And that's great. But we do want to like reduce that as much as possible still, if we want to get to like the net zero emissions world that we need to, not slide into ecosystem disaster and crisis. But definitely I think EVs are this whole discussion really is part of a multimodal look at how transportation emissions need to be addressed. It's not just, personal vehicles. I think medium heavy duty, if you think about, also encompasses school buses and the delivery vans. When transit, if we want to invest in transit, part of that is making sure that transit is as clean as possible, so that the diesel buses are being replaced with electric for people who are cyclists or pedestrians behind those buses and breathing in that air, making sure that that is cleaner. So all of those kind of work together. The infrastructure supports the infrastructure for all the other vehicles and not just for personal passenger vehicles. But it's definitely a good point about like the bigger picture here, that it's not just about electrification or just about cars, for sure.
Yeah, and part of that, Neda and I are both coordinators within the Clean and Eco Transportation campaign. Neda really leads a lot of our work with zero emission vehicles, but in that campaign, like Neda said, we're also looking at the other layers of transportation. So here in Illinois, we know the northeastern part of Illinois is an economic driver for most of the state, and our public transit system is in jeopardy with federal um, um, uh, federal relief funds expiring at the end of this year. So we need to, we're right now we're working to ensure that we've identified additional funds to save that, but not just save it, but improve the current system, knowing that we need public transit to help get people off of personal vehicles to, other transportation options. And with that, we're also introducing a bill called the Transportation Choices Act, which mirrors what Minnesota and Colorado have adopted, where they have a transportation sector greenhouse gas reduction goal, and in doing so, they're mandating their departments of transportation and their metropolitan planning organizations to create plans of action to reduce that. And a lot of that is identifying climate index scores, where transportation projects are going to be weighted on to ensure that if there's any road project being developed in the future, that those Department of Transportations are analyzing how much greenhouse gas will either be increased, or if there is the potential to decrease it by prioritizing construction of bike lanes, travel demand, bus rapid transit routes, other options that will help create better conditions for transportation in the state. Those are things that we're looking to champion with the Clean and Eco Transportation Act. Thanks, Ellen. Next question. Leah Goodman asks, anyone has any insight as to why Illinois hasn't yet adopted the air pollution standards, especially given the state of investments and attracting Rivian to the state? It makes no sense.
I know, right? It's a great, yes, I totally agree. No, but really, there is a pretty concerted, like organized effort to discredit ZEVs and electrification. There's a lot of myths out there, misinformation that if we electrify our trucks, none of our goods are going to be shipped and no one will have diapers or food. Just kind of scare tactics, I think, by, in my opinion, an industry that sees that it's on its way out, oil and gas for sure. But also I think the past policy in Illinois shows that we've been focusing on incentives to adopt, with like the manufacturing investments and things like that. I think the governor likes to call them carrots, not sticks. So carrots of encouraging the manufacturing of those vehicles here, and that would eventually like increase the market and increase supply and therefore lower prices. But I think what we're seeing is that is not enough, and we do need those sticks, so to speak, to actually make sure that they're being deployed here. And I keep bringing up Rivian just because they're a great example of the 100,000 vehicle, the contract that they have with Amazon. They're also making their commercial delivery vans like available to the public. Lion Electric was building trucks and school buses here. And a very low percentage of those vehicles ended up in Illinois, which meant it was great for our economy, but not exactly great for anything else of our health benefits or greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, greenhouse gas emissions don't see borders, right? Air pollution is more and more of a local issue, but I do think it's really important to show like how these standards are they're gradual, right? They're flexible. There's ways to achieve the requirements, the sales requirements, over time. The burden of it really is on the manufacturers to sell them here and not the individual consumer, which is kind of how it is now. I think that there is too much of a burden on individuals of having to find and access vehicles and figure out charging infrastructure in a way that if there were just more of them available here, it would be easier to find a EV than not, and therefore easier for our numbers to grow. Illinois still has like a really healthy EV market. We're expanding, we're growing. I think there's more than 120,000 at the last I checked in Illinois. And that's great, but we have a goal of 1 million by 2030 under CEJA and Governor Pritzker's goals. And we need to do more to actually bring those vehicles here, not just build them here.
Well said. Great. We have one more question coming in. This question is coming from Elizabeth Wallace. Trump is very vocal about increasing our oil and gas production here. Do you think that push will affect auto companies' willingness to manufacture EVs, or will car companies fight this more since Trump is on their side?
I mean, I think that even the oil and gas industries are against necessarily increased production here because it lowers their prices too much and therefore lowers their profits. I think on the auto company side, they plan, investments in manufacturing years ahead of time. So when the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law were passed in like 2021, 22, those investments were planned then. They're coming to fruition now, which is why our battery manufacturing capacity is growing so much in the country. I'm sorry if you can hear that. My bunny is crunching on something really loudly. It's bothering me anyway, if you can't hear it. But there's a lot being planned that actually, like, because they are all over the country, they're including in red states, including in red districts. There is a lot of backlash congressionally from like red states that they don't want to see that manufacturing progress go back because those jobs have been promised. They're building, factories and things like that. And it's a really bad look to go back on that. So I don't think that it would affect auto companies long term. I think that the market has already spoken for it. It really is just about like how quickly are we going to do it? Is it going to be everywhere? The vehicle is actually going to be accessible everywhere to get all of these benefits that we talked about, the social and health benefits.
Perfect. Well, everyone, if there are no other questions, I want to thank Neda once again for all the great information. If any other questions do come up later on, Neda did drop her email in the chat earlier. She'll follow up with folks who are interested on the Pollution Control Board proceedings next week. And feel free, once again, to sign up for CLE credits if you haven't already done so. We'll keep reminding folks. And just as a reminder, this is just one of many lunch and learns that attorneys can get CLE credits that we will be hosting in the next few months. So please keep on the lookout for our IC listserv, emails, our website, just to make sure that you're staying up to date on all the great lunch and learn opportunities, and also about all the advocacy that is going to be needed. So outside of the Pollution Control Board hearings, we're also going to be advocating for a Zero Emission Vehicle Act in the near term, which is also included with the Clean Eco Transportation Campaign. Metropolitan Mobility Authority Act is the bill I was talking about earlier in regards to public transit in the northeastern part of Illinois. So we will need all our transit and transportation advocates to be voicing and advocating for these things. Neda, any?
Thank you, Maggie, also for dropping in the chat the link to the toolkit for the PCB hearing. If folks want to look at that, that is the best resource. That's all.
Thank you all. Well, hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon and have a great weekend. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.